Hey guys, Fallen here. In this unit overview, we'll be looking at the Egyptian Classic Age myth unit, the Wadjet. They are available to set and raw, and this is via the miner god Ta. They were actually very unimpressive at launch, and I don't think I played them a lot. To add to this, Egyptians also had a poor perception just because the economies weren't strong enough in the early game. And again, it was aggressive meta in the beginning. And of course, Greek gods were more famous, and that meant Greek heroes were in play, and they are very strong against Wadjets. So you should usually try to avoid using Wadjets directly against Greek heroes. Anyways, it seems developers have been paying attention to their performance, especially the higher elo, especially in the competitive setting, and this unit got nerfed in the first patch of the year 2025. We now see the damage that they do directly versus the damage they do over time. It's been reworked. They do very little damage now over time, and most of it comes in the first initial hit. And kind of the idea is you shouldn't be having a lot of divine damage in classical age. It's usually something you get access to more closer to the end game. If you think of Mummy, and that does what, 3 divine damage per second, and you had Wadjets doing 4 divine damage per second in the classic age. So when used right, they felt very broken. Okay, so after all this rework, the point of this video is we'll try to answer how good they were, did they really need to be nerfed, and how does that compare to now? Are they still a good unit, and if and which situations we should use them? Okay, so let's start with the basics and we'll see how this unit functions. At least in an army composition, they play the same role as is played by a Slinger, which is a ranged damage dealer. And especially when you have Slingers with Electrum Bullets, which you do if you're going up by Ta, they are going to be very competitive, and you are only going to be switching between them depending on scenarios. Of course, once you reach heroic age, you will have access to some more ranged damage dealers, which is chariots and Patsuchos if you went up with Sobek. Okay, but those comparisons we'll look at later. First, let's focus on Slingers, because that is the unit we are going to be competing against for the main damage dealer spot. Slingers without Electrum Bullets, they're kind of specialized against archer units. They don't do a lot of damage to other units. However, with Electrum Bullets, they become a really good damage dealing unit, which increases 10% damage plus adds a 0.5 divine damage. And this is kind of the main part where they become a generalist damage dealing unit. Now, they have different costs. Slingers cost gold. However, Wadjet being a myth unit costs favor. So before comparison, let's first look into costs and how I value them. These are subjective. Maybe you could value them a little different, and that would sort of change cost effectiveness. But it would not have a big effect on the general feel of the unit, and that is something to keep in mind with these comparisons. So for me, I have valued food and wood as equivalent resources because it's quite easy to gather them, and you usually have a lot of them on any map, unless you're talking really late game. Gold, of course, is limited on the map. There are only a limited number of gold mines, and even those are slower to gather. And of course, favor is the slowest resource in the game to gather, and most pros agree, or like there's a general consensus that you want to value it at least 10 times any other resource, 10 times food and wood. And so that's what I will be considering as cost. So based on this, Wadjets are 300 resources and Slingers are about 90. So about 3 times as costly as a Slinger. It's important to note that one Wadjet takes same population space as one Slinger. That is 2. So we can probably consider that into the cost as well, because if you need more houses, you do need to idle a villager to build that house. Now, second factor to consider when comparing these is also how easy they are to create. Once you go up to classical age, you already have a temple. And at that point, in the beginning of classical age, it's so much easier to pump out Wadjets as opposed to, again, spending additional gold to get a barrack and start producing slingers. Also keep in mind that while barracks are cheaper, slingers will also be competing for production queue against your other counter units like axemen or the pikemen. Other than that, the creation time for one Wadjet is somewhat similar to one Slinger. So in terms of effective production, Wadjets seem far superior to Slingers. Now, in terms of stats, the defensive stats of neither unit is perfect, but it's probably the reason why you're using them safely behind some meat shield so that they don't get killed easily. And it is also a reason why Wadjets felt so weak to me at launch, because I was not using them in a unit composition and trying to tank the damage doing directly with the myth unit. Now, HP of a Wadjet is about 4 times that of a Slinger, so again they feel a lot more cost effective than Slingers, and for a Wadjet it increases automatically when you age up, while for Slingers you have to wait for upgrades to come in. Key thing to note is that if you're going up to the next stage, do not engage and waste your Wadjets, which is in general a good advice for any unit. In terms of armor, it's fairly even. Wadjets are more balanced overall with 25% armor to begin with. Slingers are more focused towards pierce armor, and of course their armor also upgrades when you get your armory upgrades every age. This doesn't happen for a Wadjet, and they are kind of ready to go as soon as you hit classic age, and you don't have to pick up any armor upgrade after that, which I really like. That it's a unit like, let's say in AoE 2 you would have your conquistadors. You can just start them using them from get-go, and they will do very well from the beginning, and you don't really have to do any upgrades to utilize them to their full potential. Now, for the offensive stats, Wadjets have 12 pierce damage and 2.5 damage over time, which they do for 5 seconds. This leads to a total of 24.5 damage in total. But this is for targets with low armor, and of course if you're talking about high pierce armor targets such as Hippias, the initial 12 damage might just be 6, and so we're going to be dealing 6 plus 12.5, so that's about 18.5, 19 damage. This is the new Wadjet after the nerf. Before, they used to have 6 pierce damage as at the beginning, and then they would do 4 damage per second for 5 seconds, and that was 26 damage. So of course total damage that they do has been reduced, and also the major part of the damage, the 20 damage that they did, was not blockable by any kind of armor, and that is the big change. And I think once we get to the data, we'll see that the biggest change has been to those high pierce armor targets against whom they are not as effective anymore. Also important to note is that the damage over time stacks. So if they attack twice and then they move to a different target, those 2 stacks are counted separate. It's not refreshing the damage over time. Instead, it's putting a new one. And so in the previous case, you had 20 damage over time plus 20 damage over time. So 40 damage over time. And that would be enough to kill low HP units, really. So the most effective way to micro them was to just take as many Wadjets as needed to put a stack of dot, which would kill the unit, and then just move unit to unit as an attack once on each of them. This is not the case anymore. The damage over time is really low. It's only 12.5. So you would have to do a bit more calculation, a bit more. You have to be a bit more careful with the unit if you want to micro them to optimize their damage output. For slingers, of course, the damage is very low. They start with a base damage of only 3, and until you get your unique tech Electrum Bullets, you're not really doing a lot of damage, especially against high pierce damage targets. When they had Electrum Bullets as one additional divine damage, that was actually really broken. But now it's a bit low, and you do want to get all your upgrades, medium slingers, along with your smithy attack upgrades before you engage. Important to note, for slingers, you don't really have to get your armor upgrades. You just want to make sure your units in front have the armor they need to absorb as much incoming damage as possible. Okay, now let's look at unit comparisons, and we'll be comparing the old Wadjet, new Wadjet, and the slingers with Electrum Bullets and how each of them fare. First, let's look at low pierce armor targets, and I'm using Axis as an example here. First, Wadjets without micro, and we are using 3 because at this point we know that in the old version they used to one-shot an axe with 3 Wadjets. And just to set baseline, let's look at data when we are not microing, and let's see how much difference microing made. So in this case, one Wadjet is doing about 5.3 damage per second, and this seems quite low to me. And let's see how it affects. So if I micro, in which I am using enough Wadjets so that they one-shot a unit, and then I'm just switching targets. In this case, we are doing a net of 12.2 damage per second. So again, it's more than 120% increase in damage. Next, let's look at slingers with Electrum Bullets, and I just want to compare the baseline slinger with Electrum Bullets without getting more upgrades from Smithy for attack. And this is just to keep the resource cost that I'm using for comparison somewhat even. And in this case, they are not really doing too bad without micro. And this is because you don't have to worry about microing the damage over time as well. Whatever is done directly is the damage you see, and they're doing actually better than Wadjets without micro with 22.6 net damage with the same amount of resources spent. And if you remember, it was only 16 for a Wadjet without micro. Now, if I do try to micro them, which would be targeting one unit at a time and then splitting in case there were some missed shots, the difference is actually not much, and at the end you see that it's about 6 to 10% difference depending on how well you micromanage the HP that was left over. Now, the new Wadjet does a lot of damage up front, so you don't have to think a lot about how the damage over time is being micromanaged. And in this case, as you can see, 2 attacks are enough to kill a unit, and then it moves on. And in fact, once we get to the end, you will see that we are doing overall 20% more damage without micro with the new Wadjet than what we were doing before. So instead of 5.3, now it's a 6.4 damage per second. This is still not as cost effective as a Slinger if you're not microing. Now, trying to micro with the new Wadjet is actually bad if you haven't calculated how much DPS, how much total damage you'll be doing. So if I try to micromanage with 3 Wadjets, my performance is way worse now. It's actually more than 50% reduction in your damage if you try to micro with fewer units than needed. But again, now if I add 4 Wadjets in the mix, and if I try to micro with that, the damage is again back up. I'm doing 82% more damage than when I was not microing. However, it's still a significant reduction from the old unit when there was a big fluctuation whether you were microing or not. Looking at high pierce armor units like Hippias, we can see clearly why the old Wadjet was so good. Since it was doing a lot of divine damage that was stacking, it's doing insane amounts of damage to a unit that has high pierce armor. And again, in this case, we are able to do 22.2 damage per second, or 22.3, which comes out to be 7.4 damage per second. And this is actually higher than when we were damaging without micro against Axe. But as we had discussed before, this is not the best way to micro this unit. You want to have enough Wadjets so that you can one-shot a unit, and then you just switch targets. So first, again, let's try to create a baseline for this, and let's try to damage without any micro. This actually doesn't seem very good because our damage has actually reduced and it's now the lowest. What I feel is happening here is we're putting a lot of stacking damage and none of that is coming into play, at least when we are not microing, because all of that is getting wasted. However, if I try to now micro with this sufficient number of Wadjets, the results are actually dramatically different. We're doing now twice as much damage as we were doing without any micro, and this is 27% more than the baseline. Now, while Electrum Bullets does make Slingers generalist in damage dealing, they still are doing a majority part of their damage as pierce damage and not divine damage. So when we look at their DPS against Hippias or any other high pierce armor cavalry, the results are really very unimpressive. And if we try to get a baseline without micro, they do about 17.7 damage per second with the 10 slingers. And something to note is that they attack faster, so we are getting more damage even if the base damage is not that high. And if we try to use micro, this really doesn't change much because there is no damage over time that you have to be carefully micromanaging. And so we again only get 6% damage increase when we try to micro. Again, plus minus, depending on how optimally you are able to micromanage, but the difference won't be a lot. The new Wadjets, if we are using them without any micro, they're actually doing a lot of damage, and it's not getting wasted because you don't have to care about damage over time micro. And so we are actually doing 12% extra damage versus what we were doing before the changes. As we had discussed before, 7 Wadjets are what you would need if you want to one-shot a Hippias. And this actually does lower damage than baseline if you use just 3. However, it is doing more damage against 7 of the old ones if you're not using any micro. And finally, let's look at Wadjets with micro, the new ones. And in this case, we see that microing is just making things worse because, again, you need a really high number of Wadjets now per unit, and they are very clunky. As you can see, the behavior, the pathing is not very optimized, and we end up 12% less damage than the baseline, and this is actually 22% less damage than before. Okay, based on this data that we have seen, let's now try to answer the questions we had put up earlier. How good were Wadjets? Did they really need a nerf? And how good are they now? The short answer is they are much better. Now, why I feel this way is because if you look at the data, in the beginning, they were very unreliable. 5.3 damage per second per Wadjet if you're not microing, and then more than 100% damage if you did micro. That was complete nonsense. When you use a unit, it should feel a very similar way whether you micro it or not. Micro should not have a game ending kind of impact, and that's essentially what they were doing. And finally, let's look at how they compare versus Slingers, because at the end, those are the two units you have that you can use interchangeably in the classical age. And there is nothing very unsurprising here. The old Wadjet was kind of unreliable if you didn't micro it, and as you can see, it was doing 30% less damage than a Slinger with Electrum Bullets. This has now been reduced. It now makes a bit more sense. It's a bit worse, but minus 15% DPS is not as huge as 30% that was before. And while microing with low armor targets and not microing with high armor targets result in somewhat similar DPS, a bigger change is for very high armor targets like Hippias, your damage will be comparable now to a Slinger instead of being significantly higher. So if you have low armor targets, go for Slingers. If you have heroes, go for Slingers. And in most other cases, Wadjets will make most sense. However, now they don't have this very fluctuation in how they perform in a fight depending on how much you microed, so at least you can get reliable results. That's all for this one though. Please do subscribe if you would like to get notified for my videos. Thank you for watching. See you next time.